So without any delay, we have to keep the time. I give the floor to Alejandra Morena, who is coming from FIAN International, and we and member also of our NGOs networks and partners, and she will present more on the right to food and the right to food and adequate food and nutrition. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you to other organizers for creating this important space, and also to the other speakers for their fantastic interventions. I'm the last one, so I'll try not to repeat too much. I will focus mainly on the human rights perspective, and in particular on the importance and added value of states taking a human rights-based approach to agroecology, and try to argue that the right to food can support them in rethinking and transforming food systems as it is clear that it is needed. This is something we all know. Food is not just something material, it is not a commodity, it is a human right. That's a human right that everyone has, and that means that states have certain binding obligations to realize it. Realizing the right to food, in short, means that states must create conditions for everyone to be able to feed themselves in dignity and to be able to fulfill all their potential. And this also entails that states must be able to provide the conditions for people to be able to access the resources that they need to produce food that is culturally adequate, that is nutritious. And this, of course, then relates on who produces food, what and how. We have seen a lot of progress in defining the content of the right to food over the past decades. States made a lot of explicit commitments. We have very interesting and important instruments, internationally, regionally. We also have seen how some how states have adopted laws at the national level. We also know that there's sufficient food being produced worldwide to feed the world. However, the picture that Emile presented at the beginning is not that encouraging. We see that hunger is on the rise, also for several years now, with 2 billion people facing food insecurity. Africa is the country that has the highest prevalence of undernourishment, with 20%. But also we see in the global north that there's problems. In Europe, 8% of the population facing severe or moderate food insecurity, and obesity increasing worldwide with all the diseases that it creates. We see the destruction of peasantry. We see that there's ongoing land grabbing and grabbing of natural resources. And we see that there's this concentration of power that was referred to around the means needed to produce food, and in general, concentration of power and corporate power. And all this creates a lot of challenges in realizing the right to food. We argue it is probably the most violated human right right now, and the threats of climate change and ecological destruction will further exacerbate this, as well as some of the new threats of new technologies that I can refer to later. So in this context, from a human rights perspective, agroecology is the way to go. And we see that it is a positive policy response to address the interconnected problems of the right to food and environment and climate. So it is clear that agroecology and the right to food are conceptually aligned. They're very much linked. This has been developed, elaborated among others by Olivier de Schutter, former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food and co-chair of IPES-FOOD. We see that agroecology is seen by peasants' movement and grassroots movements as a pillar of food sovereignty. This is what peasants' movements want. And also evidence shows that agroecology contributes to realize the right to food in its 5 dimensions of availability, accessibility, adequacy, sustainability, and participation. The previous speakers have actually already dwelled on all these benefits of the right of agroecology. Just to emphasize, this is related to realizing the right to food. So also it is something that states should consider in their policy making. So in terms of production, this has been mentioned. It is not only important for present generations, but also future generations. As with land degradation, it will be more and more difficult to produce food. Enough examples from around the world, and I'm sure we'll hear more later. Also in terms of reducing poverty, particularly for people and women and peasants in remote and poor areas. This is particularly important. So the less dependence you have on external inputs, the more income that you can also use for other purposes, such as health or education. So this is relating also to the accessibility aspect of the right to food. And also promoting agroecology can support states in dealing with the increasing urbanization and what has been mentioned before, the migration to rural areas. It is important to create incentives for especially young people to stay in rural areas. The importance of agroecology contributing to improved diets and nutrition has also already been mentioned with a lot of examples from around the world. And in terms of climate change, it is also clear that agroecology can mitigate climate change in many different ways. Just one example from an island of a group of women in Senegal, that by creating raised table gardens, they were able to deal with rising sea levels and saline soils and more frequent floods. And by having also this new availability of fresh vegetables for their families and communities, also they became healthier and they were able to have more income because they didn't have to travel to buy food somewhere else, and they didn't have to, they could also sell the surplus of the production. So I think this example illustrates all the points that I have mentioned before in terms of how the right to food can be advanced with agroecology. And very importantly, and this was mentioned by Ferguson a couple of minutes ago, is this issue of agency and putting people at the center. This is a key principle of human rights. People should be able to participate in decision-making on issues that affect their lives. Peasants, grassroots movements, food insecure women, they all need to be able to participate, and agroecology does that. And it can also, importantly, contribute to realizing women's rights and transforming gender relations. We have some interesting examples and case studies showing all the different dimensions on how the agroecology promotes women's rights, and how taking this feminist approach to agroecology is also important. Amongst others, in many of the ecological processes, we see that there's efforts to have equal participation in decision making, and also we see all these examples of women-only cooperatives where women can improve their livelihoods and be take another role in their communities through agroecology. And also we've seen studies showing that women, as we know, are taking a burden of unpaid care work, an undue burden, between 5 and 10 hours a day of unpaid work, and agroecology can support women in reducing this burden for them in many different ways that if there's time we can discuss later. So yeah, just coming to the end, again, to emphasize, states have binding human rights obligations and have made explicit commitments, and agroecology can support them in realizing these obligations. And as we've seen, there's a lot of other benefits for societies and for their populations. So we argue that governments must adopt these policies that support and encourage the transition to agroecology as a part of their obligation to devote the maximum of their available resources to the progressive realization of the right to food and nutrition. And a lot of recommendations have been already made. One thing that we always like to emphasize is the primacy of human rights. People's rights come before vested interest. They should come before profit. And therefore, it's important that governments and institutions ensure coherence with human rights when they're adopting or implementing trade agreements, investment policies, and development aid. It is important that states do not promote industrial agriculture through this kind of settings. It is also important that states ensure equitable and just distribution of resources. This is a requirement for agroecology. If people do not have secure access to land, they will not invest in agroecology on a transition. They need to have access to land, to water, to seeds, to biodiversity. And then this is why agroecology goes hand in hand with policies that protect and guarantee communities and people's land rights. Especially in Africa, this entails recognizing and protecting collective tenure rights and tenure systems. And this also applies to peasant seed systems, which are also intrinsically collective. We see that international intellectual property rights are undermining the right to seeds of communities around the world. Especially women take an important role in this in continents like Africa. And in this context, states can be guided by the newly adopted UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas that enshrines all these human rights. The right to land, the right to seeds, the right to biodiversity are there. And this is an instrument that has been strongly supported by African countries and Caribbean and Pacific countries, less so in Europe. And also we have documents like the tenure guidelines on responsible governance of land, forests, and fisheries adopted by the Committee on World Food Security that can support states in implementing policies that can achieve all this. We also think it's important, and this is something our partners from the grassroots and social movements are very keen on, is the threats that new technologies can pose. Because even though there can be some benefits, the importance is who controls and has access to these technologies. These technologies can further drive privatization and undermine the emancipatory potential of agroecology. As we have discussed, agroecology values local resources and capacities, whereas these technologies are usually coming from a few TNCs based in richer countries. So it's a question of how these things are compatible. Also, we need to have policies that support agroecological production nationally and extraterritorially, such as public procurement schemes, as mentioned. There's interesting examples from Brazil, from Lyon, from Spain. We see sometimes that when the governments change, this goes, there's a problem, but if social movements are behind, they can sustain these transitions even with government changes. And of course, as has been mentioned, where the money flows, this is creating this unlevel playing field. So, as the colleague from the European Commission mentioned, this year is important because the financial program will be developed. So this is the moment to see where the money will go into development cooperation, into research. This is the opportunity. Another opportunity is all the discussions around climate change and the national contributions that states need to have. We see concrete examples where progress has been made, where agroecological practices were linked to incorporating them in public policies related to climate change mitigation. So the Paris Agreement's obligations and other commitments, it's important to embed agroecology there. And just to finish, we have mentioned enough the participation of people, putting people at the center. They need to be there. We need to have more democratic governance at all levels, from the local to the international. This is why we're very strongly present in the Committee on World Food Security, where food producers are included in decision making, and we think we need to support spaces like this. And of course, the other side of this is curbing corporate influence and power. This is important. And implementing instruments that are paying attention to concrete groups, like, for example, the CEDAW Recommendation 34 on the rights of rural women can also guide states to realize women's rights in the context of agriculture. And finally, it is important that we see that marginalized non-food producers, particularly in urban settings, can also access this nutritious food. So we always think it's important that that everyone has access, also in children, the elderly, the sick. So it's like how we combine social protection with policies, and also, yeah, as I also address the issue of redistributing care work and valuing as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will not, in the interest of time, attempt to summarize anything. I think it was self-explanatory and very complementary.